Y'all, let's talk about poetic justice, but from a spiritual perspective. Let's get into it. See, oftentimes when people talk about poetic justice, they like to talk about the love story between Lucky and Justice, which I mean, it's understandable, y'all, because it's just so cute. But the real theme of poetic justice is healing through grief. Y'all, the opening of this movie was one of the most intense openings in movie history for me, okay? The movie opens up with Justice, who's a young black woman from South Central Los Angeles, played by Janet Jackson. Isn't she so pretty? Justice is on a drive-in movie theater date with her boyfriend, Markel, and he is brutally unalived in front of her. And of course, her witnessing her boyfriend be unalived in front of her sent her on a journey of grief. But that wasn't the start of her grief journey. See, we get introduced to who Justice is as a person. She's walking around her house and she's describing her life, and we find out that she's named Justice because her mother was in law school when she got pregnant with her. We also find out that Justice's mother transitioned when she was very young. So this is a young woman who is already on a grief journey because her mom transitioned, and then next thing you know, her boyfriend is unalived in front of her. For those of you who do not know, grief looks different for everyone, and it comes in many phases. There's anger, there's denial, there's bargaining, there's depression, and then eventually acceptance. And throughout this film, we see Justice go through almost every phase of grief, but we really see her rest heavy in the anger and depression phases. One of the ways that her depression is expressed is her dressing in all black. And I really felt like that was a brilliant creative choice to have Justice dressed in all black, to even show her going through her closet to pick out something to wear to go to work at a hair salon, and all her clothing choices is black, really emphasizes the layer of grief that is over this entire film. And y'all, what really made me fall in love with this film when I was young is the fact that Justice expresses her emotions, her grief, her journey through the art of spoken word. She is a poet, hence why the film is called Poetic Justice. But what really sent me over with this movie is the fact that all of her poems are written by the none other, the greatest, the legendary, the icon, the queen mother of poetry, the grande dame, honey. Maya Angelou wrote all of the poems for the film Poetic Justice. Maya Angelou, Dr. Maya Angelou, was called upon by John Singleton to write the poems, every poem for Poetic Justice, and she did just that. Now, most notably, people know Phenomenal Woman and Alone, but there are a variety of poems that she wrote specifically for the film. And of course, John Singleton gave Queen Mother her cameo, honey. She was one of the elders at the barbecue that they snuck up in. Cousin Pete.
Just call me Cousin Pete. Cousin Pete. Cousin Pete. That's right. Cousin Pete.
But see, Justice wasn't the only person who went through a grief journey in this film. Lucky, played by Tupac, who was the infamous love interest, also was going through his own journey of grief. It's important to remember that grief is not only triggered when somebody is unalived, grief is also triggered by any form of loss in your life. And baby Lucky, from the very beginning of the film, dealt with a lot of loss. The film starts out with Lucky finding out that his child's mother is not well, which triggers a grief journey of its own because he's grieving on behalf of his child. He's grieving for the fact that his child does not have a mother in her life to properly care for her. He then gets custody of his child. So keep in mind, Lucky and Justice are on their own grief journeys for very different reasons. Now, Lucky works at the post office and he runs into Justice at her job, and this is where the two meet. He tries to, shoot his little shot, but she ain't feeling it. She rejects him. Now, unbeknownst to them, Aisha, who is Justice's friend, and Chicago, who is Lucky's friend, are dating. Chicago needed to go on a road trip to Oakland, where Lucky lives, so he was able to convince Lucky to come on the trip. Aisha was able to convince Justice to come on a trip just to support her and just to have a good time and really to help kind of pull her out of grief. So all of them end up on a road trip together, and baby, it did not start out well. Okay, the grief was griefing, the emotions was running high, and it just wasn't good, and more loss ended up happening on the trip, elevating the grief. Baby Lucky was still trying to shoot his shot, and Justice was not feeling it at first. And that's when we got this infamous scene, honey. I'm a black woman, okay? I deserve respect. Yes, Justice. Now, Lucky experiences more loss during the trip because Chicago ends up putting his hands on Aisha, who is Justice's friend. Lucky, as a man, jumps out and confronts his friend Chicago. They end up getting into an altercation and that friendship is over. Lucky ends up leaving Chicago stranded on the side of the road. Now, again, this is another trigger of grief here because Lucky has now lost his best friend. And that's a grief trigger that a lot of people don't talk about enough. The loss of a friendship can definitely trigger heavy, deep grief. Justice, who herself is already grieving, realizes the experience, the emotional experience that Lucky is having, and she immediately builds a deeper connection, a deeper bond to Lucky. Now, they already done been bonding, but this really increases their bond, and they end up, having a good time. Then Lucky ends up experiencing more loss when they make it to Oakland, and his cousin Khalil, who he's been looking forward to seeing this entire time. He's literally been talking about him the entire trip. His cousin Khalil is unalive. And of course, that elevates Lucky's grief and sends him deep into the anger phase of grief. He rejects Justice. He destroys his studio at home. He's really going through it. Now, we have to remember that Justice was in her grief journey for a while before she even met Lucky, before she got on the trip. She was at the depression phase of grief, and after depression is acceptance. That Oakland trip was so healing for Justice because during that trip, she was able to release. And y'all, to help us move to the acceptance phase of grief, because I honestly believe that we don't ever stop grieving, right? Because grief is often triggered by so many different things, right? So we don't ever really stop grieving, but moving to that acceptance phase, which is really healing for us in grief, we have to release any pent up emotions and trauma. And Justice was able to do that on that trip in Oakland, or to Oakland. Her sharing her thoughts, her story, her poetry with Lucky was healing for her. And when they returned back to South Central, although her and Lucky had disconnected, she was able to kind of really express that I'm ready to move to the acceptance. I'm ready to move to my healing. And that's when she starts dressing in white. At this point, months have passed since the Oakland trip, and Lucky pulls up on Justice at the salon because he wants to get his woman back. He want to get his queen back, baby, okay? So he pulls up on her at the salon. They end up talking, and they get back together. And the movie just really ends with two people who have gone through a grief journey, finding healing, and then finding each other at the right time, in the right place. And y'all, I really wanted to highlight that this film is about healing through grief, because a lot of us like to focus on the love story, which is beautiful. But y'all, that love story would not have happened if that grief and healing through that grief did not happen. We gotta heal, y'all. All of us will experience or have experienced loss in some type of way, which triggers grief. Whether you lost a job, you lost a friendship, you lost a family member, you had somebody that you love or care about transition. Some people even lose themselves and they have to grieve their old self or grieve who they used to be. Grief can be triggered by so many things. Healing from grief, finding out what phase of grief you are in and moving to the next phase. And the next phase is so healing. And as we heal, we open ourselves up to that love, which is divine. Much love, y'all.